Good afternoon, and welcome to this event, part of the 30th Annual Symposium on the Holocaust and Genocide at Vanier College. Thank you for being here with us today in the auditorium, as well as for joining us through Zoom. My name is Lale Manjikian, and I teach in the Humanities Department here at Vanier College. I am delighted to present our next guest speaker, Dr. KhatchigMouradian, who will be presenting his talk entitled The Long Shadow of the Armenian Genocide. I would like to announce that following Dr. Mouradian's presentation, we will be holding a question period. We will take questions from the audience as well as through Zoom. Allow me to present today's speaker. Dr. KhatchigMouradian is a lecturer in Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies at Columbia University, and the Armenian and Georgian Area Specialist at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. He also serves as co-principal investigator of the project on Armenian genocide denial at the Global Institute for Advanced Studies at New York University. Dr. Mouradian is the author of The Resistance Network, The Armenian Genocide and Humanitarianism in Ottoman Syria, 1915-1918, published in 2021. The book has received the Syrian Studies Association Honorable Mention 2021. In 2020, Dr. Mouradian was awarded a Humanities War and Peace Initiative grant from Columbia University. I have had the privilege of collaborating with Khatchig, who years ago granted me with the opportunity to write a column exploring issues surrounding the Armenian diaspora while he was editor of the Armenian Weekly, a publication based in Boston. I am so thrilled that he is joining us here today to share his extensive research and new insight on the Armenian genocide. Without further ado, please welcome Dr. KhatchigMouradian.
Thank you, Dr. Manjikian, for the introduction. I missed some parts of it. I think there was an issue with the audio, but I'm hoping that in the section that I missed, it was mostly good things about me, and you didn't mention the other aspects. So it's an honor and pleasure for me to be here. I have, over the past more than a decade, I've focused on the study of the Armenian genocide and its consequences, its legacies over the past century. And what I'm going to try to do today is offer an overview of the aftermath of the Armenian genocide while emphasizing the role of Armenian activists in shaping the struggle for recognition and justice for the Armenian genocide. And even though my talk is titled "The Long Shadow of the Armenian Genocide," it's going to be also about how Armenians have not only tried to escape that shadow or try to live under that shadow, but also try to disrupt it. So the Turkish state's ongoing policies of denial, erasure, and intimidation have instilled in Armenians this permanent sense of indignation and an urgency to remember and remind, spurring generations to action commensurate with the spirit of their time and place, transforming a century-old crime into a simmering current issue that intermittently flares up on domestic and international agendas. Yet often mainstream media coverage and public discourse on the Armenian genocide and its legacies ignore the central role Armenians played in shaping the struggle for recognition, focusing instead on tensions in diplomatic relations and implications for geopolitics and trade. This is something we see in the coverage all the time whenever there's any discussion of genocide resolutions. A case in point is the recent affirmation of the Armenian genocide in the United States by the House of Representatives, and then the Senate, and ultimately President Joe Biden. Media outlets in the US and beyond emphasized issues such as the potential backlash from Turkey, issues of cooperation and how that would be challenged, often making no mention whatsoever of Armenian efforts for justice, or at best conceding that the acknowledgement was, to quote the New York Times here, a symbolic victory for Armenians around the world. The New York Times, the LA Times, this was the kind of language that was used throughout in most of the coverage. And while it is true that many Armenians have learned to live under or attempted to escape this century-long shadow cast by the Armenian genocide, they have also battled to disrupt it by shedding light on the crime. What I will be doing today is explore remembrance, commemoration, and activism from the immediate aftermath of the Armenian genocide until the 50th anniversary. Even though I will talk about the past several decades very briefly as well. And I will argue in this talk that Armenian survivors and their descendants, I being one, I know Dr. Manjikian is one as well, played a central role and continue to do so in shaping the discourse and prompting action on the issue of the Armenian genocide and its legacies. So in that sense, this talk picks up where my book, The Resistance Network, concludes. The armistice ended the Great War. That's where my book essentially stops. And in that book, in The Resistance Network, I demonstrate how an underground network of humanitarians, missionaries, and diplomats in Ottoman Syria helped save the lives of thousands of Armenians during the genocide. And I argue that despite violent and systematic mechanisms of control and destruction in the cities, concentration camps, and massacre sites in the region, the genocide did not progress unhindered. And I emphasize, I center the role of Armenian agency and the role of Armenian unarmed resistance as a significant factor in saving lives. So a similar frame is going to be essentially used here as I think about the period after the Armenian genocide that begins with the end of World War I. This is a period when Ottoman Syria was the place which received hundreds of thousands of Armenian deportees who had survived the initial rounds of massacres, deportations, dispossession across the Ottoman Empire, right? They arrive in Ottoman Syria, and a year later, we have also in this region, in what is today Syria, it becomes the staging ground for one of the deadliest massacres in modern history, the massacres that take place in Deir Zor. After the war, as the bones of Armenian deportees lay unburied across Syria's wastelands, Syria also cradled oases of rebirth. In fact, it became one of these vibrant communities that continued, and to this day continue to serve Armenian communities worldwide. So with the Ottoman-Turkish defeat in World War I, scores of Armenian survivors scattered across towns, villages, and encampments in Syria start heading to Aleppo. From there, they hope to return home. On the other side of the Ottoman-Turkish border with Russia, there were also throngs of Armenians from the eastern provinces of the Ottoman Empire who escaped to the South Caucasus, and their circumstances were also equally harsh. It is estimated that the Armenian Republic that was established in 1918 and survived for 2 years essentially sheltered more than 300,000 Armenian refugees. Thousands died of exposure, disease, particularly typhus, and starvation. Some Armenian survivors went beyond. They arrived in the Caucasus and continued further east, escaping conflict, civil war in the region, and settled in cities across the Trans-Siberian Railroad all the way to Vladivostok in Russia's southeast, near the border with China. Often those who followed this path hoped to get to North America. American missionary Ernest Yarrow encountered some 200 Armenians Armenian refugees in Vladivostok in late 1918. And he reported how many of them have friends in America and are hoping in some way to get there. Yet thousands also stayed in East Asia for years, even decades, helping build communities there that thrived despite conflict, war, foreign occupation. Descendants of Armenian genocide survivors who had returned to Turkey or anchored themselves in the Middle East, the Caucasus, and beyond, scattered around the world in subsequent decades. This scattering bolstered communities in Europe, particularly France, the Americas, and Australia. Again, this is what comprises the Armenian, a significant segment of the Armenian diaspora today. Now, Armenians started commemorating the genocide, the destruction of their people. At that point, the term genocide did not exist yet, was not coined yet, almost immediately after the armistice in the capitals of the defeated Central Powers. So the first commemorations are held actually in the capitals of the defeated countries, in Berlin in March and May 1919, and in Constantinople, where a memorial mass was held in December 1918. This is the very city where on April 24, 1915, the deportation and the arrest of Armenian intellectuals and leaders begins. And there is a much larger event, again, commemorating 1915 that takes place on April 25, 1919. This is a period where Istanbul is under occupation, the Ottoman Empire is defeated during the war, and there is the possibility of this kind of commemoration. These commemorations will not be possible for a long time after that, for decades. It's in April 1920, the Republic of Armenia, in turn, this is, less than a year before it becomes essentially the Republic falls, honors the victims of the genocide for the first time. And the Catholicos, the religious leader of all Armenians, declares April 24th as a national day of remembrance and officiates over a memorial mass in Etchmiadzin. You can imagine this being a gathering which was as much of an acknowledgement of persisting pain as it was a commemoration, with huge number of survivors within Armenia's shrinking borders and thousands of orphans sheltered in Etchmiadzin itself, most surviving on humanitarian aid, often from the United States. The day of mourning was shelved when Armenia fell before the end of the year to the Bolshevik forces. Soviet Armenia would have to wait until the 50th anniversary of the genocide in 1965 for the next national commemoration. Yet the declaration of a national commemoration day reverberated across the diaspora. By the early 1920s, we see annual commemoration events being held largely with a religious tone and an emphasis on somber mourning. And this becomes the norm in the nascent Armenian communities around the globe. The Armenians of Aleppo, for example, observe what was often referred to as Martyr's Day, regularly beginning in the 1920s. Let me try to share an image here of one of the earliest commemorations. This is from Aleppo in the early 1920s, just to give a sense of the mood and the crowd. So on April 24, 1930, which coincided on a Thursday, schools were closed in Aleppo and several commemoration events were held, including a requiem service officiated by, again, the religious leadership at the 40 Martyrs Cathedral, followed by a commemoration event in the nearby Armenian Schools Hall. This is a typical kind of commemoration and has been for a very long time. Now, if for the survivor generation, Martyrs' Day marked a day of grief for lost family members and hometowns, for their children born in the diaspora, it stood for a sacred duty. A newspaper announcement of the 20th anniversary commemoration held in Boston, Massachusetts noted, "It is the sacred duty of every Armenian to attend the commemoration in order to pay deep respect at least once a year to the memory of our hundreds of thousands of martyrs," end quote. For decades, commemorations around the world largely mirrored the ones that took place in the aftermath of the Great War. They featured memorial services, artistic performances, political speeches. They were often held under the joint auspices of Armenian Apostolic, Catholic, and Evangelical churches, and eventually they brought together Armenian political parties and other secular organizations. Although the organizers and the participants of the commemorations were primarily survivors and their descendants, the events also drew attention from outside the community. This attention, of course, does not compare by any stretch with the attention that the Armenian genocide and its consequences have received since the 50th anniversary of the genocide, and most certainly today. And so this is the survivor generation and the generation that is the first generation that is growing up in the diaspora across the world is grappling with the challenges of making sense of a lost homeland and how to reconnect to it. And as survivors reconstitute their community life away from their ancestral lands, the memory of what was often referred to as the Great Crime and life in the old country before it constituted a powerful bond. Hundreds of compatriotic unions mushroomed. These were unions of Armenians from a particular village or town. One union of Armenians from the Kuri region established close to 20 chapters in North America in 1934. People from the same town or village sometimes cast thousands of miles away from their place of origin, often socialized and married each other. The survivor generation, steadfast in its conviction of imminent return and reclamation, strove to recreate histories and geographies tucked behind the borders of Turkey in the minds of the subsequent generations. There's an entire literary genre, Hushamadian, a memorial book that emerges in this period. More than 200 titles, many specialized periodicals dedicated to Armenian populated towns and villages in the former Ottoman Empire. And these books were published in the Armenian diaspora and Armenia over the past decades, beginning from the 1920s and 30s. And it really gives a sense of this kind of connection and the effort to really keep the memory of the ancestral homeland alive among the first generation of diasporans, with the hope often of being able to go back. Now, in many ways, this is not, the survivor generation, the burden that the survivor generation was carrying was multifaceted. It was about rebuilding community. It was about starting life from scratch. It was about, dealing with the, with the shadow of the genocide and its immediate consequences, as well as trying to chart a new life. And in this environment, they often name their children after long lost family members, spaces left behind, or aspirations and longings. Verej, the term for revenge, and its female equivalent became common first names in this period. And in the absence of a Nuremberg trial equivalent for the Armenian genocide, the survivor generation also took justice into its own hands. Trials were indeed held in Allied occupied Istanbul, sentencing perpetrators to death in absentia. But most of the leaders, the perpetrators of the Armenian genocide, the Ottoman Turkish leaders, were beyond reach. They had fled the country, many to Germany, while those that the British had imprisoned in Malta were released as part of a prisoner exchange deal, all in the aftermath of World War I. So in this context, an Armenian political party, the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, decides in 1919 to assassinate the perpetrators of the genocide. And by 1922, lead figures of lead perpetrators were assassinated in Berlin, Rome, Tiflis, modern-day Tbilisi in Georgia, and beyond. This included, of course, the Interior Minister Talat Pasha, the best-known assassination. Talat Pasha is considered as the architect of the Armenian genocide. The Ottoman Grand Vizier Said Halim Pasha, the Minister of Navy, Jamal Pasha, leading Committee of Union and Progress member Bahad Shakir, and others. This project was referred to as Operation Nemesis, and it made headlines around the world. And here we see the ways in which this connects with the coinage of the very term genocide. It influences, the Operation Nemesis influences a Polish Jewish university student named Raphael Lemkin to pursue the task of establishing an international law against attempted annihilation of whole ethnic groups. It's critical to look at this, though, also from the perspective of the Armenian experience. While it has become widely accepted in recent years that the World War I destruction of Armenians influenced Raphael Lemkin's work, the efforts of Armenians in support of Lemkin's campaign to secure the adoption of the Genocide Convention and its ratification by parliaments around the world has received less attention. Let me offer a very brief background here. Reading about Talat Pasha's murder in newspapers in 1921, Lemkin felt that the assassin, Montelirian, had upheld, and I'm quoting him here, the moral order of mankind, end of quote. And then Lemkin writes, but can a man appoint himself to mete out justice? Will not passion sway such form of justice and make travesty of it? At that moment, my worries about the murder of the innocent became more meaningful to me. Still quoting Lemkin. I didn't know all the answers, but I felt that the law against this type of racial or religious murder must be adopted by the world, end quote. Lemkin's search for answers culminated in the coinage of the term genocide in 1943 and his lifelong struggle to pass a law against it. 2 months after the third count of the Nuremberg indictment stated that defendants had conducted deliberate and systematic genocide, the Armenian language daily newspaper in Paris published an editorial again talking about the coinage of this term, using information from the French newspaper Le Monde. And the editorial, and I quote here from the editorial, it notes, a new word was used in the Nuremberg trials, which means terasbantun, end of quote. Terasbantun is the Armenian word for genocide. And then the editor of the newspaper writes, he says, we read these lines, we follow the Nuremberg trials, and our mind instinctively wanders to a faraway world where war crimes took place 30 years ago. Where were the jurists and judges back then? Had they not discovered the word, or was the bloodthirsty monster, in reference to Ottoman Turkey, so powerful and unreachable that they could not punish it? Although this was a dominant sentiment in the Armenian press from the Middle East to North America, Armenians around the world strove to secure the adoption of the convention, Genocide Convention at the UN. And then they did everything to help Lemkin and others secure ratification. Again, let me read from Lemkin's writings here to illustrate this point. Lemkin writes, the Armenians of the entire world were specifically interested in the Genocide Convention. They filled the galleries of the drafting committee at the Third General Assembly of the United Nations in Paris when the Genocide Convention was discussed. An Armenian, Levon Keshishian, the well-known UN correspondent for Arab newspapers, helped considerably through his writings in obtaining the ratification of many Near Eastern and North African countries, end of quote. So at the same time, as the UN Convention is adopted and there's this process of securing ratification in parliaments around the world, you see how Raphael Lemkin himself is working with Armenian intellectuals, writers, journalists, among others, to help secure ratification in the United States, by Congress, as well as by other countries around the world. To give one example about which I have written before, the editors of the Hyrenic Daily and Hyrenic Weekly newspapers in Boston worked closely with Lemkin on this. Let me show some images of correspondence between Raphael Lemkin and Armenian intellectuals and editors, where they're coordinating their efforts. This is sent to the Armenian, where you see it says, Chairman Armenian, your previous help on genocide of greatest importance. This is Lemkin connecting, writing to the Armenian. Kindly arrange that Armenian survivors of genocide should write letters to senators on Foreign Relations Committee urging immediate ratification of the Genocide Convention. Personal experiences in massacres described in a simple language should be possibly included in these letters. The senators should be asked to include the letter in congressional record. Kindly reply, Lemkin, Yale University. And then you also see responses such as this, right? In compliance with your request, this is now James Mandalian writing. Our Armenian language newspaper, The Hyrenic, has published an editorial call inviting our readers to write letters to the members of the Senate, etc., right? I'm happy to report that Senator Lodge was very prompt in his reply to me, the copy of which you will find enclosed. I'm showing these examples to highlight and demonstrate the fact that oftentimes when we present narratives of struggles for justice, and such as is the case in the case of with the Genocide Convention and Lemkin's efforts in this regard, it's also important to reflect on the fact that the victim groups, the targeted groups, right, are also exercising agency, are also playing a role in shaping the world that they would like to see, despite the asymmetries that are present, despite the asymmetries of power, despite the challenges that they are facing. Remember, this is a community that at this point, right, has barely managed to rebuild itself. We're talking about, in the aftermath of World War I, the interwar period and its challenges, and then World War II, and this is in its immediate aftermath. So, it's critical to think about it in that regard. So a few months before Raphael Lemkin died, he penned an article for the Hyrenic Weekly, one of the Armenian newspapers that I mentioned earlier, published in Boston, in which he said, and I'm quoting Lemkin here, "The suffering of the Armenian men, women, and children thrown into the Euphrates River or massacred on their way to Deir Zor have prepared the way for the adoption of the Genocide Convention by the United Nations." And he adds, again, quoting him, "1 million Armenians died, but a law against the murder of peoples was written with the ink of their blood and the spirit of their suffering." End of quote. Now, Raphael Lemkin passes away in August 1959. His wish of securing U.S. ratification is not realized by then. U.S. ratification comes only in 1988. But with the 50th anniversary of the Armenian genocide nearing, Lemkin had equipped Armenians, primarily in the diaspora, but also Armenia, Soviet Armenia, with a powerful weapon to advocate and push for justice. The Armenians who had helped Lemkin attain the ratification of the convention by legislatures around the globe now engaged in yet another struggle, a decades-long battle for the acknowledgement of the Armenian genocide. You'll see why I started with the New York Times and LA Times quotes in the beginning to emphasize how, even though much of the coverage focuses on, U.S. relations with Turkey when there's recognition, or any country whenever it recognizes the genocide, or there's any kind of discussion about justice for the genocide and its consequences, right? It's always about relations with Turkey and what's going to happen, etc. And rarely you have any kind of engagement with the very struggles of the group that was targeted in 1915. In the early 1960s, Soviet Armenian leaders also started preparing the groundwork for large-scale commemoration of the 50th anniversary alongside the Armenians across the world, across the diaspora. And so you have this major mobilization and that is taking place. In the diaspora, tens of thousands poured into the streets from Beirut to Paris to New York, chanting slogans demanding justice. An editorial in Harach in Paris explained, "We do not demand revenge. Revenge begets revenge and the cycle does not end. We demand punishment and reparations." Which is on the 50th anniversary. The commemorations were not limited to large metropolises. In France alone, the genocide was commemorated in at least 15 other cities, including Lyon, Marseille, Grenoble, Bordeaux, etc. The same phenomenon occurred worldwide. 2 years later, again, this time in Armenia, in Soviet Armenia, on the 27th anniversary of Armenia's Sovietization, the Armenian Genocide Memorial in Yerevan officially opened. Since then, the memorial has served as a symbol of honoring the dead and celebrating survival. And the destination has become a destination for hundreds of thousands on April 24 every year. In the following years, Armenian genocide memorials were erected on public land around the world, often not without pushback from the Turkish diplomatic representatives. The plans to construct one such memorial in Montebello, California stands as one of the earliest cases where you do have this kind of pushback. By 1965, Armenians had moved from mourning under the shadow of genocide to demanding justice. It is impossible to overstate the significance of the 50th anniversary in uniting Armenians around the globe in a struggle for recognition and reparations, and in forging a new, patently extroverted culture of commemoration aimed at focusing international attention on Armenian demands and embarrassing Turkey for its crime and its continuing denial. A decade later, this campaign will continue all over Europe, and ultimately, it's going to culminate beginning in the 1990s with advocacy organizations in the Armenian diaspora mobilizing globally with an added impetus and campaigning for genocide recognition by parliaments, governments, and states around the world. Regaining independence from the Soviet Union in 1991, the Republic of Armenia also played a role in this campaign for affirmation. As a result, more than 30 countries, mostly in Europe and South America, as well as, of course, Canada, the United States, Canada close to 20 years before the United States, have officially recognized the Armenian genocide in one form or another, and in some cases also called on Turkey to follow suit. Heirs of genocide victims have filed lawsuits in the US, Europe, and even Turkey against insurance companies, banks, and other institutions that had benefited from the genocide, with partial success. The battle for recognition and reparations remains a driving force for Armenian activism worldwide. It also is often fueled by current political crises, wars such as the recent war on Nagorno-Karabakh, where again it became patently clear how an unrepentant denialist state continues to pose a danger when it has not confronted the legacies of the crime committed more than 100 years ago. So in their attempts to make sense of the enormity of the crime, victimized groups often emphasize in their activism, art, and scholarship, the distinctiveness of their experience. For Armenians, it is being the victim of the century's first genocide. This was something that was constantly repeated, and how it became a template for the Holocaust. We know now that the Armenian genocide, in fact, was not the first genocide of the 20th century. That dark distinction belongs to the Herero and Nama in German Southwest Africa. In the case of the Holocaust, there's the argument of unprecedentedness, uniqueness, and at the same time, though, as memory studies scholar Michael Rothberg puts it, the conceptual framework to which commemorations and ordinary citizens have addressed the relationship between memory, identity, and violence is flawed. Against the framework that understands collective memory as a competitive memory, as a zero-sum struggle over scarce resources. And instead, he sees memory as multi-directional, and quoting him here, as subject to ongoing negotiation, cross-referencing, and borrowing, as productive and not privately. Armenian studies scholarship, and I'm wrapping up here, has made great strides since 1980s. Most of the new cutting-edge research outside of Armenia was published in English and French, and helped shape comparative studies, comparative genocide studies. The pioneering works of scholars such as Hakimdadarian, edited volumes by Richard Hovanesyan, remain the standard texts until the 2000s. But then you have a new cohort of historians and sociologists who, bursting into the scene, produced seminal works and series of conferences that redefined the field. Today, Armenian genocide scholarship is multifocal, integrated into comparative studies of genocide, histories of late Ottoman period, Middle East, World War I, concentration camps, humanitarianism, the literature of catastrophe, etc. The Turkish state's denial, ongoing denial of, and the sustained activism against it have fueled academic interest in the subject. And conversely, the emerging scholarship has quelled doubt in most academic and political circles on the veracity of the genocide, marginalizing the official Turkish position. Now, even within Turkey, the denial edifice now stands tenuous. Against a backdrop of official denial of genocide, decades of government-sanctioned indoctrination, whether it's textbooks, film, TV shows, organized efforts of cultural erasure, suppression of public debate, and the instrumentalization of the small Armenian community in Turkey, primarily in Istanbul. Activists within Turkey have increasingly targeted the cracks beginning in the 2000s, as an environment of relative tolerance allowed some space for civil society to tackle taboos. Grandchildren of Armenians Islamized during the genocide started writing articles and books about their Armenian roots and their journeys of discovery. Works by reputed genocide scholars were translated from English, and Armenian literature became readily available in Turkish as well. Still, individuals and groups in Turkey confronting denial paid dearly with their careers, freedom, and even with life. Court cases targeted many who raised the issue of the genocide for insulting Turkishness, including Nobel laureate Orhan Pamuk and Turkish Armenian journalist Hrant Dink. Dink's assassination in Istanbul in 2007, a murder that implicates the police and state apparatuses, was a radical but not uncommon attempt at silencing, which backfired. Hundreds of thousands of Turkish citizens marched at Dink's funeral, chanting, "We are all Hrant, we are all Armenian." This is also a period where public commemorations began being held in Turkey, culminating with the centennial of the Armenian genocide. But allow me to conclude with a very short personal anecdote. More than a decade ago, right before the war in Syria had erupted, I visited Deir Zor, one of the sites that are often used as a synonym for the Armenian genocide. Some scholars refer to it as the Auschwitz of the Armenian genocide, the site where hundreds of thousands of Armenians were massacred, and this is the site that also my work focuses on. And a new mass grave was discovered in around that time, which we visited. And it was discovered because they were building in this village a new school, and they started digging up that open area, and bones started protruding from underground. And they built the school right next to that site, to that mass grave. Yet the mass grave itself became the playground for the children. So we arrived there with a number of journalists from The Economist and other publications. This is the mound where, again, all we had to do is scratch the surface, and shards of bone and skull, pieces of skull would just protrude. And as these children from the school saw what we were doing, they in turn started bringing pieces of bone. And when we asked them, what is this? They would say, Armenians. I took this image back then, and I did not realize that years later, this image will take on another layer of meaning for me. In recent years, as I have given talks on the Armenian genocide, on the Middle East, I've often shown this picture. And I've asked a question, rhetorically, saying, I wonder where these children are today. And in which refugee camp? Deir was one of the, again, hotspots of the war in Syria. In which refugee camp? In which country? What is the fate? What is their fate? What is their future? What kind of world have we are we planning on passing on to them? Is it a world that confronts the evils of the past, struggles for justice? What kind of world are these children going to be growing up in? And this largely rhetorical series of questions was actually answered in a very real way once, when after a talk, I received a message on social media from someone in Deir saying that the boy in the white t-shirt in the front of this picture was actually killed during the war in Syria. So more than a century later, in the very place which Armenians consider to be synonymous to their destruction, dispossession, death, and displacement remains the order of the day. So in many ways, this is not just a talk about the aftermath of the Armenian genocide. This is a talk about the importance of giving voice, amplifying the voices of those who are speaking up against injustices around the world. This is about standing alongside those who are engaged in that struggle. And this is about thinking about the possibility that generations from now, perhaps one generation from now, some of those children that you just saw in the picture in Syria will grow up, will receive the kind of support and encouragement to pursue their education and perhaps become professors, and perhaps one day stand in front of an audience at colleges and universities and talk about their experience and the survival and the resilience and the resistance of their own peoples. Thank you very much.
You covered an extensive period of history over a century in a very brief matter of time. So we will now open the floor for questions, either from the auditorium, but also through Zoom. Do we have a question on Zoom currently? Yes. Okay, should I just come over there and maybe, or can I see it on the screen maybe? And okay, great. So here we have a question from Zaven Zakarian, who asks, Turkish refusal of recognizing the Ottoman era race killings of Armenians as genocide, strongly based on fear of ultimate loss of territory, an issue that separates the Armenian case from that of the Holocaust, where there are no Jewish territorial demands from Germany. The so-called Sèvres syndrome looms greatly in Turkish psyche. How do Armenians and Turks solve this issue? Can this be resolved?
I believe in optimism of the will and pessimism of the intellect, to quote here from Gramsci. And so I would, my response would come from that kind of position. As the question is phrased, it is true that territorial concessions has been a fear in Turkey for decades, but it's not the only reason why Turkey has vehemently continued to deny the genocide, even though the way in which denial is formulated has evolved and changed over the decades. And it's important to note that there are a few other components as well that are as important. Important. One of them is the very fact that the foundations of modern day Turkey is very much rooted in the destruction of the Armenians, Assyrians, Greeks, and others of the Ottoman Empire in many ways, both in terms of the perpetrators who ended up becoming leading figures in the Republic of Turkey and therefore founding fathers of Turkey, of modern day Turkey. And this is a critical component. Also in terms of the theft of property and assets. We're talking about multiple times the annual yearly budget of the Ottoman Empire in terms of what was stolen, and essentially, and this is as many scholars have demonstrated, have essentially created the middle class in Turkey in those early decades. So in many ways, the Armenian genocide and the destruction of communities such as Assyrians, Armenians, Greeks, and others is at the very foundation of Turkey. Add to it the fact that there's this machine that's been producing denial for over a century, from the very beginning of the genocide all the way to this day, and you see how impossible it is. It may seem for a shift to occur in any easy manner. That's one. The other aspect, of course, is that so it's at the foundations. There's the property and theft and dispossession, and then there are the territorial fears and demands related to what was referred to as the Sevres Treaty. But is there a way forward? Yes, there is a way forward that ultimately will hinge on a combination of external pressure, which is inevitable because Turkey has over and over proven successful in suppressing voices within Turkey, and unless that environment changes drastically, right, that is always going to remain a factor. A combination between internal pressure, external pressure, and commitment to not just recognition, but also pushing for a sense of justice, even so many decades later, is critical and is crucial. I do not know when and if what is going to and how things are going to change. What I do know is that if there is no engagement and activism and a push towards justice, certainly nothing will change. And I think that is the critical element here, and that is sort of the optimism and pessimism from where I come, and that is true for all struggles. That is true for all struggles. We can look around us and see a number of examples in the here and now of lost causes that were considered lost, wars that were considered impossible to win, and that ended up not only with outcomes that were not expected, but actually may shape and change the future that we as we know it. And I believe the struggle of Armenians and others for voice and for justice ranks among those cases.
Thank you for the question and for your response. Khatchig, second question here we have is, now that we have the United Nations with a structure, laws, a tribunal, how come we are not able to react faster to the human genocide that we are facing in Ukraine right now?
You know, in many ways, what we have been seeing in recent years is just a reminder that oftentimes our ability to intervene, our ability to engage is marred by a number of shortcomings. It's often related to double standards by different countries, it's the way in which international law is enshrined, it's the fact that, we are, our laws and the implementation of our laws are as imperfect and oftentimes as divided as we are as members of an international community. And ultimately, I believe that communities, and even more so governments and and international institutions, can only spur to action in the face of tremendous pressure that comes from below. And I do think that, and that is critical and crucial. Now, is it possible to stop atrocities and crimes when they're committed by superpowers and major powers, regional powers on this planet? It's not. We have seen this over and over for a very long time in recent decades. But ultimately, it's also important to note that the level of awareness that has emerged, the modes of communication that have emerged, and the ways of solidarity globally between different networks of activists, politicians, others, local movements, have also inspired hope. They don't inspire hope in terms of eradicating genocide and mass violence, but they do inspire hope about the possibility of pushing back, about the possibility of consequences, the possibility that impunity is not something that is going to constantly remain the order of the day. The images of violence that have emerged in recent weeks have been testament to that. But at the same time, it's important to note that as we speak, and as the world witnesses what's going on in Ukraine, we also have many parts of the world where the voices of victims are not heard anywhere near the urgency that we are seeing today in the case of what is going on in Ukraine. In places like Yemen, in places like Tigray, in places a couple of years ago like Nagorno-Karabakh, right? We are experiencing, we are witnessing, or deciding not to witness, right? Death and dispossession and refugee crisis after refugee crisis, and it just has become something that is the backdrop. And of course, when what is happening in Ukraine, of course, is happening in the heart of Europe, and that has created a different kind of visibility. But it's critical to also reflect on how our lack of action and our silences, oftentimes in other parts of the world as well, will only engender more and more. It's interesting. We often think that, and this argument is often repeated, right? Had there been some kind of consequences for the Armenian genocide, there wouldn't have been another. Had there been right? We always think that consequences are a deterrent. They will never deter, all crimes everywhere. But I do think that ultimately it is the only tool that we have. The tool of international justice, the tool of solidarity and between movements mobilizing for justice, for reparations, a tool for these different groups coming together for those kinds of struggle is all we have. Whether it is the push for reparations here in the United States, for slavery, for the destruction of Native Americans, whether it is the push for acknowledgement and reparations of other crimes elsewhere in Europe and Africa and beyond, I do believe that ultimately solidarity networks are the best way to implement pressure, and weaknesses in these solidarity networks will only make the world more siloed, more disconnected. Every group will only think we are out alone on our own, and we have to only, stand for our own group and our own people. And that will only lead to and embolden more and more crimes and more perpetrators to get away with what they're trying to do.
Thank you, Khatchig, for that answer. Are there any questions in the audience? There is a microphone, or I can come see you with this microphone if there are any questions. Do we have time for one more question, Marlene? Or yeah, okay. Khatchig, I'll ask you a question if that's okay. Going back to your work, your research in your latest book, The Resistance Network, where you really address and highlight unarmed resistance, and who basically helped save thousands of lives. And you really emphasize on agency as well, of the communities existing in Aleppo, as they were accepting deportees, but also the deportees themselves, the refugees themselves. I'm curious as to why this emphasis on the agency of survivors, victims of genocide is only coming to surface now. I mean, you've done very significant work in unearthing it. Why have we not, heard about it yet? And also, does denial have anything to do with it? Does denialist rhetoric have anything to do with it? So if you could just kindly address this moment in history where you've unearthed all this type of research. Thanks.
Thank you, Lale. I would certainly, denial certainly has everything to do with it. There has, in recent years, been more scholarship, increasingly focusing on Armenian sources. But one of the things that denial has done, the Turkish state's denial has done, is constantly, of course, questioning, the Armenian experience and the voices, the Armenian voices that are telling the survivors and others that are telling their stories, that oftentimes in the pioneering works of Armenian genocide scholars, such as Genocide and others, right? The focus and the emphasis has always been, let's look for the documents in the Ottoman archives. Let's look for the documents in the German archives, right? These were the, from the perpetrators and the allies of the perpetrators, because that is not something that can be challenged, right? When you have an entire state machinery, right, engaging in an active denialist, campaign, the focus then becomes, how can we counter and challenge and respond by presenting evidence that cannot be challenged as, subjective, tainted, etc. It's so in many ways, the very effort to fight against denial at the same time was silencing the very voices of the victims. That was not being done intentionally, of course. That was not the intention, but that was the outcome in many ways. So denial certainly had a component. Also, the genocide itself had an impact. This is also a product of the genocide, right? As a consequence of the destruction of the 1.5 million Armenians, the Armenian language itself was not a language that scholars, non-Armenian scholars, were rushing to learn as they were going into the study of the Ottoman Empire, the Middle East, or even genocide, right? Those who did want to venture into those areas learned Turkish, Ottoman. And in many ways, right? So you see how these different factors are accumulating and having an impact. So ultimately, the genocide itself and its organized campaign of denial focused the attention on this kind of narrative, on presenting other voices and other sources that prove the missionaries and the diplomats who wrote about this, the memoirs, and that's what we heard. The same thing has to do with those who saved Armenians, right, during the genocide. The focus is always on non-Armenians. The focus is on, European missionaries, diplomats, American diplomats, and others who went there and said, and it's a way in which you emphasize and you make the crime also relevant in a global context, right? Those Armenians who oftentimes, as I demonstrate in my book, really not only risked their lives, but essentially most of them died or were killed in the line of duty, never survived to write a memoir or an account or write reports to governments and embassies and consulates or their own, missionary organizations. Their stories have not been told because, again, it was a challenge. It was this reality where every step of the way, the voices of the Armenians were not considered to be, were silenced, and and also add to it the fact that oftentimes when we tell any story of victimization, we often think that if we render the victim completely helpless, the case for the crime and the case against the perpetrator will become the strongest, right? So if we render the Armenians completely helpless, having absolutely no agency, having not attempted any effort, in any way to resist, right? It somewhat makes the perpetrator group, the crime more heinous. In fact, that is not the case. In fact, again, we are stripping the targeted group of their humanity, of their agency, because everyone resists. Nobody will just go, go silent to that good night, right? To quote the poet. It's going to be, it's just that as historians, activists and others, when we suppress that, we're also, having the adding insult in a certain way to injury. And in many ways, that is, I think, a critical component. When we talk about any crime, by the way, I mean, whatever is happening today in different parts of the world, whether in Yemen, Ukraine, elsewhere, the refugees, right? Portraying people who are targeted during war and violence and crises as completely helpless, as utterly, in order to create more sympathy, is not the way to go. If anything, as I said earlier, it's important to amplify their voices and stand next to them as they chart their own way forward, right? The way they envision it. Thank you for that question.
Thank you, Khatchig, for that answer. Are there any other questions from the audience or on Zoom before we wrap it up? No. Well, I want to take a moment just to thank Dr. Mouradian for his very insightful talk and also the work that you do to provide a voice, voices that are typically silenced. So that is really important to highlight. And on that note, also thank you to the organizers, Marlene Grossman, and everyone else involved with the symposium and everyone who attended. Thanks again. And on that note, wishing everybody a good afternoon and thank you for being with us this afternoon.
Thank you, Lale. Thank you, Marlene. Thank you, everyone.